They are further a core organizer of Queer in AI. Do you want me to, should I start the bio-over? Okay, so Arjun Subramonian is a computer science PhD candidate at UCLA. Their research focuses on the fairness and ethics of machine learning and natural language processing. They are further a core organizer of Queer in AI. They are a recipient of an Amazon Fellowship, NSF NRT Fellowship, Eugene V. Cota Robles Fellowship, and FACT 2023 Best Paper Award. So please welcome Arjun, and I do want to let everyone know our next NL seminar. So we're off next week because it's USC spring break, and we'll be back on the 27th at the normal time at 11 o'clock. And we'll have Julie Collini, who's actually been here before and is from Stanford, so we're very excited to have her back. But yeah, please give it up for Arjun and their talk.
Thank you so much for the really kind introduction, and thank you for accommodating my time. So as Katie mentioned, I'll be talking about from democratization of personal names, how we can reimagine some NLP practices towards justice. This is all the stuff that Katie already mentioned, so I'm going to skip ahead. But I'll be talking about two topics in particular today. One is the way that we talk about democratizing language technology, specifically in research papers, and the association of personal names with sociodemographic characteristics. In particular, how do these practices obscure public control of NLP as a field and its research artifacts, and also reinforce different kinds of social inequality? And how can we reimagine some of these practices towards justice? So, as I said, the first paper is going to be talking about democratization. This was a project that I was really, I'm grateful to be able to do with my amazing co-authors, including Baker, Dietrich, and Zurich, and it was published as a paper at EMNLP 2024. So maybe you've noticed these things, I definitely have, that it's increasingly popular to use some of these words. For example, our nonprofit organization OpenAI is launching a program to award how much ever money to set up a democratic process for deciding what rules AI systems should follow. Hugging Face has talked about partnering with Intel to democratize machine learning hardware acceleration. And Anthropic has looked at how we can explore the potential for democratic processes to influence AI development. So kind of begs the question in some sense, like there's a lot of, it seems to be kind of a marketing term in these uses, but like, are we talking about a serious research direction here, or are we talking about buzzwords? I also want to preface a lot of this talk by saying that maybe the way that you understand democratize just naturally in this field is just like not related to democracy whatsoever. But I think like we're going to take the kind of like assumption here that like in practice, or like at least fundamentally, democratization comes from democracy, and so like you would expect some alignment between those two topics. So anyways, just kind of summarize the main research questions in relation to that motivating example. We ask in this project, how do we understand democracy? So what do we understand by democracy, democratization when we invoke these terms in our research? To answer this question, we examine conceptualizations of these terms through a large-scale mixed methods analysis of every use of the string democra, Cleaning Star, in papers published in the ACL Anthology and the machine learning conferences. So that includes iClear, ICML, NeurIPS. And there's a little plot here that kind of shows the number of mentions of democracy, like a little histogram of that, and the number of papers. And we can see that across this entire corpus of paper data that we've collected, that a lot of papers seem to mention things like democracy, democratization, but mostly just once in the paper. And that's kind of like a bit of a teaser for, those of you who might be familiar with hit and run mentions of specific terms, like in the introduction or conclusion. So the punchline of our research is democratization, as opposed to the way that NLP researchers seem to think about democracy, is used to convey the ease of access to or use of technologies. And this is often done without meaningfully engaging with theories of democratization. Again, as opposed to other uses of democracy, which are often grounded in theories of deliberation or debate. And this is really important because outside of AI, we found that a lot of fields use democratization in a very different way. So there's community science and ecology, which is like, what's represented in the picture here, where people kind of go out into the field, they look at animals that they've observed, and then they like jot down like, the species of the animal. And like there's collaborative citizen expert inquiry in political science, where kind of people in small villages might experiment with different political governing methodologies in collaboration with researchers to figure out what governance strategies work better in practice. Also, democratization was used actually at the advent of the internet to describe the propagation of pro-democratic and pro-democracy ideals, rather than just saying that we're making the internet accessible to everybody. So basically, it's like very different definitions of democratization outside of NLP. And if we continue using democratization in the way that we do in this field, in a very distinct way from democracy, we risk misrepresenting progress towards actually capturing democratic values and redistributing power in and public control of AI. So we advocate something, I think, relatively simple. Like if you talk about democratization in a paper, maybe we can offer some hints of clearer conceptualizations of the term, and that can hopefully strengthen progress in our field towards more democratic technologies beyond just superficial access, like I can download your model and Hugging Face. Okay, so I'm going to go into some of these research details a little bit more closely now. The first thing is with the data. So as already mentioned, we collected paper data from all these different conferences. And the way we did this was we took all the paper metadata and text available from open access PDFs using the Semantic Scholar API. Thank you so much, Luca Soldani, for helping us with API use. And then we extracted all the sentences that contain that substring democra. And we ended up getting 4,203 excerpts across almost 2,000 different papers. And you might already notice that there are a lot of substrings that include democra that actually have no clear relationship to democracy, or maybe wouldn't give us any information about how the authors are thinking about those terms, such as Democrats. So we removed some of the named entities, like the Center for Media and Democracy. We looked at a lot of these uses of democra in tables that just showed examples from different data sets. We also removed any mentions of these terms in non-English languages. So that's a really big kind of decision to make, that we're focusing on our conceptualizations in English. Yes, John.
So 2/3 of the papers from the first excerpt got filtered out.
Yes.
Is there a majority or plurality reason, of the cases that you used? Was there 2/3 that were from the Sound Media Democracy or something like that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So most of them were actually from these middle two bullet points, like the motivating examples and modeling data set examples. A lot of examples that people had in their papers were from corpuses that were the parliament, the EU parliamentary discussions, and so they talked about democracy quite often, and so those things ended up in tables, in papers.
And it was only in there that you threw it out.
Yes.
Not if it was in there.
Yes.
You can talk about democracy and also that would not be enough.
If you talk about, we don't throw away the entire paper. If it contains this, we don't think at the paper level just yet. We just take every excerpt from a paper that mentions these terms and just remove the excerpts that specifically are from tables.
Okay, so even right?
Yes.
Cool.
I think the other kind of major case was in early 2000s. There's a lot of work on understanding how people are talking about democracy online, and Twitter. There's a lot of Twitter data.
So democracy is data.
Yes. Yeah. So we ended up getting some 916 excerpts from around 500 papers in total. So now we went into all these excerpts and we qualitatively coded them to identify salient overarching themes that give us some insight into how authors are thinking about democracy. And so we did a first pass over some random samples, and we identified 4 major categories that emerged. The first one was things that were necessary and beneficial to democracy. So these were things like discourse or majority voting. Another theme was danger. So a lot of people were talking about things like misinformation being dangerous to democracy. That was another kind of salient area. We ended up finding that democratization in and of itself had almost its own kind of category, because people were using it very distinctly from that first pass of samples. And so this was the way we defined this theme, was just any use of the word democratize or democratization was its own category. And then another kind of major area was math. So a lot of people are using words like democratic using words like democratic to describe mathematical objects or ways in which machine learning models were operating. So things like democratic matrices, mathematical models of democracy. So after we came up with these initial themes, we had like two authors independently annotate every excerpt with an explicit and, if applicable, implicit theme. So the explicit theme was the authors are explicitly stating that this is a necessary thing for democracy. But implicit was more like democracy cannot function without blank. Like that was kind of like, it's not exactly that the author is saying that these themes are there, but we can kind of infer. And then the same authors label each excerpt for values such as like consensus and equality, and more broadly concepts associated with democracy. So some concepts included like misinformation, elections. We just kind of wanted to get like related keywords from all the excerpts with respect to democracy, democratization. So here are some examples. I won't go through all of them, but like the right to access judicial information is a fundamental component of Canadian democracy and its judicial process. And so we found that the right to access information, that's something that's necessary or beneficial for democracy. And some of the concepts associated with that include access, information. Maybe this is another example. It's a little bit distinct to give you a sense of what's going on. There's a math paper that was talking about like this is a totally democratic method where each vote counts the same. And so this was kind of describing some mathematical model of democracy, and then some concepts where that were relating to like equal contribution.
So the top two and the bottom two kind of have a big distinction in terms of the literal democracy in that it is involving rule, presumably meaning like, day-to-day life governmental rule of the people, versus metaphorical democracy in the bottom two, which are not, it's hard to tell from that. I assume if you're saying the theme is math, it's democratic, but there's potentially not. Well, I guess if you're saying both, it's hard to tell what you're saying out of context there, but
yeah,
there's more ability for metaphor in those two.
Yeah. So I guess I should clarify a little bit here. Like you were correct, like at a high level, that we are already starting to see some patterns for the first two, which are more about necessary / beneficial versus dangerous, or like actually talking about real democratic processes where people have opinions about like how people should participate in governance. And then the latter two are like in the math case, like this has like a flavor of democracy to it. And in the bottom case where it's not exactly clear like what exactly the governance structure is, or if there is a way for people to participate. It's just that we're giving them access to something.
Yeah. If you talked about, say, a mixture of experts having like democratic voting access into the classification decision, that would be something you could potentially annotate. Right?
Yes, exactly.
There's no person involved in that case.
No, not at all.
Sorry, but the expert also.
Yes, and like to address your second point, where like these excerpts, they didn't always give enough information to make these annotations. So where necessary, we had the paper ID, we went back into the paper, and we in the second, third example, looked at what were they talking about? Because this could be the description of a democratic system in a country, and so we wanted to make sure that it was actually in reference to a model as opposed to Canada's parliamentary process. Okay, so then we collected, aggregated all this information about our themes and concepts. And if you recall, we had two annotators for these different themes and different values and concepts. And we found a high Cohen's kappa for all the annotations, which means we're recovering relatively similar information across all the data. We found, if you're looking to break down the different themes, we found that the majority of the papers were talking about democratization, and then a lot less, but still a decent proportion of papers were talking about what is necessary or beneficial democracy, what is dangerous democracy, and then some papers that were in the math realm that were discussing democratic flavors of different technologies or mathematical models. And then we also broke down our concepts and values, and we found some interesting things here. So if you look here at the right side of the screen, we looked at all the papers that were tagged as involving or all the excerpts that were involved democratization, and then here all the other excerpts that correspond to all the other themes that we saw. And if we look at the value on the x-axis, we have all the values and concepts associated with those excerpts, and we found that generally when it comes to democratization, the kind of values and concepts were like access, affordability, reducing barriers, ease of use. Like these were the kind of main keywords that we saw used in association with democratization, versus in the for all the other themes, we saw kind of things that are more related to like the rules of how a democracy should function, things like deliberation, debate, equal contribution, diversity. And so we're already seeing kind of divergence in some sense between access to technology in the case of democratization excerpts versus more things around like deliberation or like majority voting or consensus in like the case of democracy. And even within this kind of realm of like papers that are more focused on democracy as a governance kind of methodology, like there was some contention around what people thought of democracy as. Some people said that like random selection of representatives is super important in democracy, and then other people said consensus is like one of the fundamental process like components of democracy. Other people said that like you need to have a majority system, like you need to have majority rule under democracy, and voting is an essential component. So all those kind of conceptualizations of democracy are also slightly different, but we noticed that like even though there's contention there, there's kind of some relation to an actual governance structure as opposed to like the democratization excerpts. The kind of thing that was similar across all the different excerpts was it all seemed like relatively aspirational. Like people were kind of imposing like these like value judgments about democracy and democratization. They were saying like democracy should be this thing that involves like majority voting, or democratization should like improve the access of technology for people. So it was kind of things that like almost like objectives that people had when talking about these two concepts in their papers. So now that we've kind of established there is some distinction between the way people talk about democracy and democratization, we zoom in on democratization. In particular, we asked, like, for the excerpts that were tagged as democratization, what is being democratized, how, and to what end, which I think was really exciting and fun to look at a little bit more deeply. So we annotate papers on targeted democratization, the causes of democratization, and the goals. So some example excerpts here, like we aim at an ambitious goal of democratizing the cost of pre-training. And so here, like the thing that is being democratized, the target is the cost. It's not clear what the goal is with like, like reducing the cost. It can definitely be inferred, but that part is not particularly specific. And then the cause of that democratization, like what factors are leading to it, are not specific either. So if we look at these kind of results in aggregate, we find that 59% of papers do not state causes of democratization, like maybe specifically like what things in their paper are causing those like reductions in costs or like reductions in barriers to actually happen. 75% do not state the goals of their democratization. And it seems that in a lot of cases, like the authors describe democratization as almost like this separate autonomous process that is minimally affected by their contribution. So what I mean by this is they talk about democratization as some like overarching project of machine learning research that they're maybe contributing to, but it's something that's inevitable. It's going to happen. Like democratization is occurring. We are like contributing our little piece of research to this overall direction. Yeah, so to drive some of these points home a little bit more clearly, some of the authors posit that their research democratizes technology, but do not elaborate on how that occurs. So like, is that through digital infrastructure? Is that through like specific governance structures? Is that like through participatory methods? Those things are not stated. Oftentimes the last sentence in a paper, like where they just kind of state that this is something that's happening. And popular causes of democratization that have been listed were things like reductions in required compute, time, and cost, which all again are related to access in some ways, which kind of again goes back to what we were saying earlier about the way people talking about democracy is very different from the way people talk about democratization. Yes.
Did you make a distinction between, I guess, like democratization to researchers from more places or more organizations versus democratization to the general public? Because like, when I see reductions in required compute, to me that means like democratizing from a few industry groups to like more academic labs. Yeah. But I don't think it necessarily implies democratizing to like the average person on the street?
Yes, that's a really good question. And I think like maybe that's something that we could have done a better job annotating for, which is like what is the intended audience if it's stated for the democratization process. I do have to say though, like anecdotally from this annotation process, it was never, especially because it was like the last sentence in a lot of papers, it wasn't like they were explicitly stating that this will cause a shift from like industry labs to like academics having more like having the ability to run these models or use these particular methods. And there was definitely like very few, if no mentions about like people in the global south now suddenly having access to technologies and being able to use them. Like the intended audience was definitely like very rarely stated, if at all. Yes.
Are you going to get into demographics of the sources?
The demographics of the sources.
I have a question about that. But if
okay. So I don't have it in the slides, but there are some results in the appendix. So we definitely ran the results. I don't remember like the things we ended up using in the appendix, but we looked at like the affiliations of the different authors and also like the funding bodies that were donating to like or that made the research possible. But it's not going to be in the slides.
I guess so. I wanted to know the major. So funding body is very interesting to me. The questions I've written down were just in terms of the distribution of industry versus academia versus the baseline distribution, but also about the country resource. Yeah.
Like you want to like understand like what the impact of those things are on
were excerpts that mentioned democratization over or underrepresented with regard to source being industry, source being academia, source being US, China, Europe, Global South.
Yeah. So from like my recollection with like running these things, like overwhelmingly the people talking about democratization were people at like American R1 universities, places like UCLA or Berkeley or Stanford, and the funding bodies were actually like the funding bodies are not always kind of like acknowledged in the same way. So like of course it's NSF, but that has like large coverage with respect to like American universities, but there were quite a few distinct European funding bodies, like a lot of like German and French government funding bodies where like that were funding papers where this kind of like use of democratization was quite common. Yeah, so the targets of democratization were like a little bit more nebulous. So it was like, are we democratizing NLP, AI, research access, like just very broadly? It was not clear like what part of any of these concepts or entities were being democratized, and what does it mean for these what does it essentially mean for these concepts to be democratized at that level of abstraction was a very difficult task to kind of understand. In terms of goals, like overwhelmingly it was about increasing access and use, and particularly without requiring expertise. And I think like some of these goals were a little bit more elusive. Like they were very noble goals for sure, but like it's without deeper understanding of like what your cause of democratization is or what your targets are, it was hard to kind of contextualize some of these goals. And then I won't get exactly into, for the sake of time, we'll get exactly into like the process of picking the papers that we did for chose for closer reading, but we kind of like use a diversity objective to pick like papers with various excerpts to read more closely and actually validate that our findings were correct. So far, like these results were presented based off of reading the excerpt and like maybe reading around it a little more closely if like we weren't sure from the excerpt alone, but then we wanted to actually go in and read the full paper to make sure that like maybe in like the paragraph 2 of the introduction, the authors actually wrote like a really extensive discussion of how democratization is going to work for this particular technology, and we didn't want to like discredit them. So yeah, we did do a validation of closer reading, which didn't really change the results, but we did look at 30 papers that had a diverse kind of framing of like what democratization looked like with respect to excerpts. Yes.
What are the colors in this figure?
Okay, I'll get into it. I like didn't want to get into it for like because I want but I'll like explain because I put the thought in the slide, so now I must let people understand what's going on here. So what we did was we took like the excerpts and we ran them through like a sentence encoder to get different embeddings, because we noticed kind of like similar structures in the way that people were talking about democratization. Then we kind of did some clustering, we did spectral clustering on those embeddings to kind of break them up into like 3 separate groups. And that kind of like choice of 3 came from like the little elbow method, like to pick like an optimal number of clusters heuristically. And then we picked papers by looking at papers kind of like in the center of different clusters and on the boundaries of clusters. So we effectively wanted to get like a diverse sample of excerpts with like in our embedding space. And then we looked at the papers at which those excerpts came from more closely. The colors represent different clusters. Yes.
So then is what looks like a third cluster, is that those are all selected papers?
Sorry, yeah, there's some black dots in here that like maybe look very similar to the purple dots.
Okay, just I think that
yeah. So like these colors, like the yellow and the green and the purple, represent like the different clusters, and then we picked some black dots in the middle of the clusters and at the boundaries between the different clusters.
Okay.
Yes. I'm happy to answer more questions too. I'm enjoying the interaction. It gives me like a second to like not go on to get off my soapbox for a little bit. Yes.
So in terms of like the goals, like you mentioned that like it was predominantly about increasing access and use. Was there anything that mentioned kind of like the inverse, like exemption from, like when we think about like certain like biased content moderation systems, or like the ability to opt out of like I search in Google now and like it does an AI summary when I didn't ask for it? Like,
I see. As far as like, at least like for the excerpts that I annotated and the papers I closely read, I didn't see much of that. That would be a super interesting use of democratization. I think these like the use of democratization very rarely occurred in the context of like papers that were talking about bias or like fairness concerns. It was more so like this kind of like algorithm that increased like the sampling efficiency for reinforcement learning methods, and now like we can democratize RL to like a larger audience. Yes.
I was just wondering because this concept seems to be taught more in the political philosophy literature.
Mm-hmm.
Have you looked into publications?
Like in the sense of like to like frame this research more, or
in the sense of like data points, like you were looking at AI publications, right?
Yeah, so we just wanted to look at like how people in machine learning conferences and NLP conferences were talking about democracy and democratization, but we weren't like looking at like political science papers.
Yeah, what do you think about looking at those papers? I kind of feel like we have democracy and AI. We're doing an intersection.
Mm-hmm.
And right now we're starting from the AI literature. Can we start from the other side? Like the democracy literature, how they adopt this concept of AI?
That's a very interesting question. I feel like it's going to be equally impoverished. That's kind of like my like a priori kind of assumption, but I think that would be really fascinating and be a really good research direction. Yes.
Yeah, so much as probably I would guess that before the scientist comes to our conferences, and if there's anything talking about democratization, they'll be like, yeah, you guys know what I'm talking about. Just I can relate to the story of going to a humanities conference and going to their AI session. Well, I only got through part of the first talk, which is this is one of those talks where the talk is reading the entire paper for 20 minutes with no slides or anything like that, verbatim. Anyway, they talked a lot about like Socrates not wanting to write things down in Wittgenstein, and anyway, that was the session about our
I had a similar. So I don't know. I noticed that like there's a lot of talking around democratization without like a clear clear statement of what you mean. And when I had a similar experience, not so much at AJS, but when I went to a law conference, I was talking with a bunch of lawyers who work on like privacy and security at risk for tech in general, but for AI. And there was a lot of talking around AI. And like they would just use the word AI, and I would just want to like stop every speaker and be like, no, what product do you need? And so like I would imagine there's a lot of sort of talking around AI as if it's one thing. You know what I mean?
And similarly, democratization or democracies. It seems like we probably talk about it as if it's more or less one thing.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, so far, it doesn't seem like there have been presentations of democracy as anything other than a good or a goal. Is that true?
So like democracy or
There was a
democracy?
discussion of the dangers of democracy.
Yes.
There was.
There were discussions of dangers, yes, in like in excerpts or in like.
Yeah, like it seems like the notion here has been like we want, like the goal is to democratize. The goal is for democracy.
Yeah.
But one could say that there are problems with democracy, and that democratization is something that we shouldn't do. And I'm just wondering if that occurred in your data, as far as you know.
Yeah, that's a really great question. From my recollection, again, I don't think there was anything, at least like it wasn't something that showed up in like the salient themes, but there wasn't like definitely like a large discussion of like we shouldn't engage in democracy. Because I mean, I think I agree that like democracy also has like quite a few potential like intrinsic issues around like what is like a majority rule look like. Yeah, and I think especially for democratization, there was not very critical use of that, like in a negative sense. But it almost makes sense to me because it's kind of like a feel-good word. Like if you are someone who's advocating for democracy or democratization, it seems like you're a good person. And like I think this might relate to more kind of concepts. So now I'm just talking a little bit more philosophically. This might relate to more concepts in NLP where we're clinging on to like the feelings or vibes associated with a word rather than like the actual kind of like flesh or meat of the word itself. Yeah.
It's sort of like a similar vein. I feel like we're in this like era of like, do we make our work more palatable, right? Particularly trying to get funding and like, things like that. I'm curious like what your thoughts are specifically on like the use of like democratization, like as like a buzzword in our field, like how you feel like that's going to interact with like the current world.
Yeah. It's something that I think like would be a really great follow-up, like even for something more qualitative, or like actually talking to funding bodies or people who are applying for funding, like government officials. I think like maybe like 4 years ago, I would have been hesitant, but even like maybe less hesitant than now to be like, okay, people are talking about democratization, but maybe it's like within the realm of conferences and they're trying to like make their work seem more palatable to a reviewer. But now that like we have like AI has really entered like mainstream conscience and like there's kind of this vague public perception that like people are building AI for like social good or like to benefit humanity. Of course, that's not everybody, but like there's a portion of people who think that like when we're talking about democratization, we're like again absorbing those like good tenets potentially associated with those terms and like further increasing hype around AI when there doesn't need to be that hype. Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier not seeing like a ton of this use of democratization in like fairness and bias related papers. I'm kind of curious like what the like relative distribution in terms of like the task or the specific topic, whether it was just like, general like text generation or like their specific NLP tasks that tended to use democratization or use it with a specific goal or subtheme like more frequently.
Yeah. So I think like the main kind of, so I also want to clarify like we set out the goal of NLP, but like we also realized a lot of NLP papers were published in machine learning conferences. And so like we didn't like want to distinguish that like this is an NLP paper versus not an NLP paper. So there is a bleed in of like a lot of machine learning and more core AI work. But I think like I don't know if there was a specific like task that I felt like was kind of consistently using this term, but rather things around like efficiency, like kind of like algorithmic approaches to making more efficient machine learning models or systems, like overwhelmingly used like things like democratize. Yeah, or and the other kind of realm was like interfaces for the public to access like these tools. I think those are like the two main sorts of like flavors of papers in which democratization was used a lot. Okay, so what? Does democratization have to mean democracy? And isn't access a good thing, right? It's something that I keep on asking myself like throughout the paper. Because I'm like, we're showing this result. And like, I guess it's like what Rebecca just asked right now, where it's like, does it actually matter if we use this term in the correct way? And like, why? Especially if it's like, if people are intending to do good things with their democratization work anyways. But we'll recall that, like, and again, this is like, continue what Jay said earlier about like people are talking about democracy and political science. Democracy is about participation and oversight and power and control. Those aren't all necessarily good things, but like it definitely has something to do with governance and like kind of public control over some kind of, in this case, like systems. And there's like over 3,000 years of democratic thought. So people have talked about deliberative democracies, democratic spheres, democracy and power, radical egalitarian democracies. So we probably should ask, like, to what extent are we connecting our talk, discussions of democratization to those things about democracy, even if we just mean access when we talk about democratization. So to dive a little bit, before we go into that, I want to dive a little bit more into like what the theories actually can do for more democratic NLP technologies. Like democratic theories can make discussions about technologies more representative and efficient. Like when we're looking at how we can decide on rules that AI systems should follow, we can diversify forums for dialogues. I think there's a lot of really good work in both democracy and AI, talking about dismantling barriers to participation in kind of like deliberation processes. And there's some forms of democracy that I think are like particularly interesting, like deliberative democracy. So participants can like debate a particular object, like whether a policy or a technology on its merits, and make collective decisions about its implementation. And like this kind of intentional translation of democracy to the governance of technology like engages a wider group of people in conversation about the use and application of research artifacts, as opposed to like just the authors of the paper. And then maybe like the artifact goes into the world and then you don't have any more control over like where your data set's used or where your model's used, and suddenly it becomes like an individual decision of different groups at different universities. There's also this idea of the democratic spheres. So there's this kind of proposition of like a plurality of public spheres that can afford better representation in marginalized communities. Like we can kind of work within different kind of intersections between communities and the state to get different like people's perspectives in a way that doesn't like suppress any group of individuals' perspectives, and then kind of coalesce those perspectives together. There's also ideas around democracy and power. We can talk about like how does technology afford access, agency, or distribute power, which is like very much in line with like democratic ideals. And also we know that technology can consolidate power within a small set of actors, which is more authoritarian. So like kind of figuring out where we are on this, definitely not a spectrum, but in this continuum of like democratic authoritarian ideals with respect to how technology distributes or like concentrates power is super important. And I think there's a lot of interesting ideas from like radical egalitarian democracies too, where we can use like the frameworks to understand and address barriers to public participation, maybe in like participatory methods, and resolve uneven distributions of power. So again, we know that democratization is overwhelmingly being used as a stand-in for access in many of these papers, but democracy like has all these different kinds of theories that have been developed over the course of many years. Maybe it's okay that researchers talk about democratization as access as long as they're engaging with these theories, right? So we actually looked at the depth of engagement that different NLP researchers have with literature outside the field as kind of a proxy for understanding like what is their engagement democratic theories. Yes.
On the past couple of slides, was this what the context of what this paper is talking about, or is this your?
These are my like statements, like from like our literature review of like different people talking about democracy. Like we just provided some kind of like different places where researchers can look if they're looking to like kind of draw an understanding of how people have thought about democracy. Because I think like democracy is also like maybe like my perception before reading all these works too is you just get like everybody involved in a population together and you just vote and that's it. But I think like, of course, there are a lot more considerations, like how much do private companies influence like the elections? How much are we like dismantling barriers for people to be present in the room to actually like vote? So yeah, I think there are these different kinds of things that people have theorized about that can actually be talked about at least briefly in NLP papers towards like informing better ways forward with democratization. Yeah, so with regards to engagement, we posit that discussing democracy or democratization without connecting to like established theories is problematic. I mean, on one hand, it reflects like subpar citational praxis, but also it really risks misrepresenting how grounded AI is in democratic values. So we provide some complementary views from this kind of research objective, which is like where and how often is democracy or democratization mentioned, and what kinds of references are cited and how are they used. So we like look at we have metadata from semantic scholars. We can see like which sections people are using or mentioning democracy and democratization, and we also have access to citation network from semantic scholars. So we can see like what works these papers are citing. So we find that the majority of papers that mention democracy or democratization related terms only mention it once in the entire paper, and most mentions occur in the abstract introduction or conclusion, which suggests that democracy is like, the discussion is very impoverished or it's under discussed in NLP and machine learning literature. But we do also want to like emphasize that a large number of mentions of democracy related terms does not necessarily signal higher engagement with theories within a paper. For example, the mathematical papers that I mentioned previously use the word democratic maybe like 50 times within the same paper to describe their matrix. But that doesn't mean that they're necessarily engaging with democratic theories at a higher rate. In terms of what papers are cited, we found that a majority of citations for these papers are from computer science and linguistics, and 181 papers, which is about 37% of the corpus, cite 0 papers outside the disciplines of computer science, mathematics, and linguistics, and 88 cite exactly 1. And this is surprising, given that like the invocation of democracy and democratization. I would hope that maybe like a good portion of the paper cite at least 1 paper on how a democratization should work, or even if they don't explain the citation in greater detail, it can even be a hit and run citation. But they're like a large portion, 37%, cite 0 papers outside of their field.
So for these one site papers, is there like a small set of canonical citations that everybody is citing?
Yeah, so we I don't know if it's in these slides, and I can't remember off the top of my head, but there were like particular fields, like canonical works, like in particular fields that people were citing that were kind of like at the intersection between like political science and like text as data. So like people were, like, I think like there's certain works that were talking about like, how people are talking about democracy online from like the early 2000s, and that work, which could be classified as like political science but engages in some computational methods, was like canonically cited over and over again as like the interdisciplinary reference that people were using like in their work. Yeah, I would need to like, I don't have them in the slides. I need to like look back at like the analyses to like remember the exact names of the citations. It wasn't like there was one citation, like it wasn't like so overwhelming that there was that one paper that was being cited over and over again. But there were some works that were at kind of like the boundary between different fields that were being used multiple times. Yeah, and most extradisciplinary citations, again, citations outside computer science, math, and linguistics, were from the social sciences. So a lot, but I think the important thing to note is like where these things are being cited within the paper. So around 82% of them were cited as background, which is still good. Honestly, like I think I'm like really appreciating that people are going out of their way to like read the references and put them in the background, or at least like be aware of their existence.
What is the distribution of the years of these publications that you were using?
Yeah, so we used everything that has been like digitally archived as part of like all the conferences. When you look at like the trend, I think of course like there's a skew towards like recent years because there's been such a like uptick in the number of NLP papers published. Yeah, that's all I can really say right now. Just like a exponential skew towards like maybe the last like 5 or 6 years.
How do these frequencies of like extradisciplinary citation compare to frequencies of total citations, right? Because I would imagine that in general, people have more citations in their background and their method than they do in their results section?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I think that's like this normalization question is something that like effectively normalizing, or like I guess like with reference to like what is the baseline number of citations, I guess you're asking. Yeah, actually that is a very good point, and I think something that we should have like normalized with respect to. I guess like we're kind of like taking the flip side here of like we would like to see at least one or like a good number of references in the results and methodology section, regardless of the total number of citations, like in each of these sections. But you're 100% correct that like we should be normalizing with respect to like the total number of background citations across all papers, which we did not do.
I think it might be interesting if you do follow up work.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's a really good point. I will follow up with you on that.
Okay. 48.4% citations of 50%. That would be much higher.
Yeah, I mean, also like the kind of metadata we have for the different fields comes from Semantic Scholar, and so like sometimes the tagging is not always perfect.
But I think it's probably going to do a decent job, right? Like it's kind of, I mean,
it's possible that like for example, like a lot of the computer science papers. There are a lot of computer science papers that could also be classified as linguistics, and like the linguistics like category was determined to be like the prominent tag for the paper. Yeah, but also
even any ACO paper as a ACO etc. as a computer science paper, let's say, right? Like I don't know, most of the papers I read from CL are citing most of the papers from ACL.
Yes.
Right. You get lead for sure. Right?
Yeah. I mean, you definitely is true that like it's a lower number than I think maybe one would expect like as a prior for like just general papers. Like, of course, it's across like all the papers that have some mention of democratization. But like that's a good point. I think it also goes back to Katie's point of needing to like normalize potentially. I guess in this case, if we take like the assumption that like all the papers cited like by a particular STAR CL paper also come from STAR CL or one of the machine learning conferences, then that normalization factor would be 1. But I think like actually diving deeper and seeing like what the likelihood of that is generally would be a good idea. Okay, so yes, like a lot of the exterdisciplinary citations are primarily like background, and very few are in the context of methods and results. And also like from our reading of the excerpts, we saw that quite a few were like hit and run citations, where people would say like democracy is this thing, like we should aspire towards this objective, and then cite. But like they wouldn't necessarily be like quoting something from that or expanding upon what that work did, which is not always necessary, but I think like all the excerpts we read kind of operated in some similar fashion. Yeah, so of course, like we closely read things. We wanted to make sure that our findings the trends were at least like, consistent or valid. So we closely read 15 papers with backgrounds, methods, and results citations of extradisciplinary work. And so we wanted to kind of see like if the papers that looked like they were doing really well, like that they had citations of extradisciplinary work in like the background section, the methodology section, the results section, like what were they citing exactly, and like were they actually doing a good job? And actually like we did find that they were doing a good job. So like it kind of just the citation approach is somewhat valid as a proxy for understanding like actual engagement with democratic theories. So papers that cited political science and economics literature in particular we found that they exhibited deeper considerations of theories of democratization. And then we confirmed our results with a closer reading of like 24 additional randomly selected papers from our corpus, just to make sure they weren't like engaging with theories of democracy outside maybe like the places where things were being cited, the extradisciplinary references were being cited. And we provided some positive examples in the appendix, which I'm realizing now would have been interesting, like for me to put in the slides. But I think like definitely check out the appendix for some really good, well, at least what we thought were really positive examples of people like engaging with theories and then trying to translate them to their research. It doesn't always have to be successful, but it's like kind of promising to see that people are thinking about it. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly give a summary of the findings. So yeah, we had like a thematic and large-scale mixed methods analysis of all these different papers from NLP and machine learning conferences. And we found that their use of democracy and NLP and machine learning exhibits infrequent operationalization of what democratization entails, sometimes vastly different views of what democracy means, and low levels of interdisciplinary engagement. And so we have provide some recommendations now for what researchers should do to better describe what they mean by and how they intend to operationalize democratization in their paper. And some of them are like, they're not like huge asks. I think they're like kind of like quite small, I think, suggestions. So I think the first step is like reflecting on like what values and concepts you're associating with democratization, how your understanding of democratization may be contested, and how your usage of democratization may be overloaded and overhyped. So all we're asking here kind of is like, when you're using the term, like, which is still totally okay for now, just like what values you're associating with it, and like what purpose does it serve in the paper. And then maybe you can ask yourself, is using access sufficient instead of democratization? Like maybe we can use access rather than democratization when discussing access related questions in papers. And then I think going beyond that, if you are still, like I really want to participate in democratization of technologies, can we go beyond access as the sole condition for participation, and discuss actual processes for democratic oversight of research artifacts? So it'd be good if you use the word democratization to actually talk about what are the causes, targets, methods, and goals of your democratization. What would it mean for your research to be fully democratic? And which opportunities and limits to public participation and control actually exist. So this is where it's getting a little bit more like involved, and maybe not everyone has like familiarity with like democratic theories. But I think just kind of like thinking a little bit more critically about your use of the term, and then like if you are still interested in democratic oversight as a process, just kind of adding a couple of sentences to your paper, or maybe your impact statement saying like, this is how I would go about doing this at a high level, or like, here are the concerns that I have when implementing democratic processes for my research. The other thing we ask is to detail how your understanding of democratization and democracy is informed by theories that have been developed over the course of the last few centuries. And you can draw from and cite relevant literature, or if you don't have relevant literature to cite, just be clear about this. Like, I'm not really pulling from any relevant literature. It's not really informed by any theories that I've read about. And then I guess the last thing is kind of reflecting on like where your conceptualizations of democratization fall short with respect to your research and goals, and which challenges remain unsolved by your work. So I know that I have very little time left. I have about 4 minutes, but I guess I'm gonna not go into this paper as much, but I'll quickly give the kind of like high level spiel here. This paper was kind of this is like a little bit less kind of methodological, where we like not like dove into data, but it was more of a position paper on like our feelings about the use of personal names and their like kind of relationship to sociodemographic attributes within NLP. So we know that like personal names are proper nouns that are used to refer to individuals, and they have like quite a few uses in NLP. Like we've been building systems to identify and disambiguate uses of personal names within a corpus. Another one that I think was the main motivating case for us was like passive analysis of social media content, where people were like we're scraping Twitter data, maybe in like the mid 2000s, and then using like NLP models to infer the sociodemographic attributes of people from like their usernames, or other kind of like personal name information that was present in their bios. And then more recently, like the 2010s, people have been using the same kind of passive analysis to understand disparities in academic publishing and media representation. So like in NLP, there were quite a few papers like women are underrepresented in the ACL anthology at this rate, where they have been like, inferring gender from like names of authors. And even to examine model bias and harm. So I think this is something that like Katie's super familiar with, especially of like doing like this winnow bias style kind of analysis, where you like have to pick the correct pronoun to refer to one of two different subjects within a sentence, and you're going to test the model for gender bias and co-reference resolution. So I think there's definitely a paradox here, which is like personal names are used to refer to individuals, and they kind of let you kind of uniquely represent people mentally. You can underscore the significance as individuals, but on the other hand, they also clearly kind of have a relationship to organizing communities and indexing things like gender or race. So I'm going to skip over the next few parts. It's basically a lot of variation in societal convention with respect to names, and we talk about all these like interesting examples of that, and then talk about the validity issues with using names and the ethical issues with inferring sociodemographic attributes from names. Skipping over this too, but I guess the main question that I want to pose to all of you today is, when you're using names in your research, like, are you aiming to study names, or are you studying people via their names? And those are two very different kind of research questions. You should ask yourself, like, what aspects of names are you interested in? What aspects of people are you interested in? And then I think beyond asking, like, what's your context and what kinds of harms apply at the end, is that still worth it? Like, I think with the ACL ontology thing, like, we have a lot of studies now of like the underrepresentation of women at conferences and like conference proceedings. Do we need to do another analysis that shows that like women are underrepresented like in publishing? And like, what if we are doing that, like, what are the actionable kind of insights the study will generate that actually lead to like us fixing that problem in the field? If you don't have plans for that, then maybe it's not worth kind of like doing this, because a lot of the research that we surveyed in this work showed that like people were open sourcing their name, like their gender prediction from name models, or they're releasing data sets that like associated people's personal names with their gender. And like, that's something that's just on the internet. And again, there's no democratic control or oversight of those kinds of resources, no community control of those resources. They've led to derivatives, they've been reused in different ways. People kind of do like ethical laundering, where they say like, someone else built this, so I'm not responsible for the ethics of this tool. And of course, we know that trans people change their names, like you already like misinferred someone's name, so now like that's stuck in the internet for like a very long time. Yeah, I wish I had more kind of dive into this, but maybe I'll make the slides available to Katie and we can share them somewhere. But this is kind of like the questions I want to leave you all with today. So I talked about democratization, personal names, some kind of very fundamental things that seem to be relevant to NLP for social good applications. We can just rethink some of our uses of these different concepts, and hopefully that creates a little better of an environment for people doing this research. Yeah, that is all. Thank you so much.
This was a super great talk. Thank you so much, Arjun. I was getting compliments on your talk over Slack and in Zoom chat, I think, so great job.
Okay.
So anyone have any like super burning questions? We are at time and I want to be respectful of everybody's time. All right, well, thank you so much, Arjun, and we'll see you for the next NL seminar 2 weeks from today at 11 a.m. in the same room. All right.